Hi, I'm Benjamin Peters. I'm a member of the Non-Killing Political Science Research Committee, and I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk about peace constitutions and the potential for non-killing state policy. I want to thank Joan Evans Pym, Director of the Center for Global Non-Killing, for the invitation to give this talk, and I'm very glad to have the opportunity. I'll be talking about four main topics in this presentation. The first is on our species' typical capacity for peaceful behavior. The second is on modern state making and the emergence of constitutional frameworks. The third is constitutions as peace systems and the function of peace constitutions. And then I'll be talking about two case studies, the Peace Constitution of Costa Rica and the Peace Constitution of Japan. First, let me begin with some discussion on our species' typical capacity for peaceful behavior. I would recommend to you Dr. Doug Fry's presentation in this same series from the Center for Global Non-Killing. His talk is titled "The New Non-Killing Paradigm: Perspectives and Evidence from Anthropology to Zoology." And you'll find that here on the Center for Global Non-Killing YouTube channel. I should say Dr. Fry is also a member of the Non-Killing Anthropology Research Group. I'm going to be covering a little bit of the information that Dr. Fry covers quite well and comprehensively in his presentation. And some of what I'll present here comes from his research and from other colleagues' research. The first thing we think about when we think about species' typical capacities for behavior that's peaceful in nature is just who we are and what we are as a species. So if we think about Homo sapiens, we know that the genus Homo emerged some 2 million years ago. It may have actually been more like 3 million years ago, but certainly 2 million years ago, the genus Homo emerged as a distinct group. And then our species, Homo sapiens, emerged at least 200,000 years ago. We also know that anatomically modern Homo sapiens arose about 50,000 years ago. From Dr. Fry's research, this is from his chapter in War, Peace, and Human Nature, we know that war is simply absent over the vast majority of human existence. But with gradual worldwide population increase, the shift from universal nomadic foraging to settled communities, the development of agriculture, a transition from egalitarianism to hierarchical societies, and very significantly, the rise of state-level civilizations 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, the archaeological record is clear and unambiguous. War developed, despots arose, violence proliferated, slavery flourished, and the social position of women deteriorated, taking place in the last 10,000 years. So in other words, in the last 5% of the history of our species. We know from Dr. Fry and other anthropologists' research that for more than 95% of the distinct genetic history of our species, we lived without war. This doesn't mean that there wasn't killing or there wasn't violence, but there was certainly no group-on-group war as we would define it today or as we understand it. We also know in terms of our species' typical behavioral repertoires that we exhibited species' typical behavioral repertoires of the small band, nomadic, foraging, and egalitarian social relations, which is how our species lived for the first 95% of the species' history. And this research from Dr. Darsha Narvaez shows that these small band nomadic foraging groups typically exhibited high self-control and patience. Their relationships were characterized by kindness and generosity. They were typically open and flexible in their community and interpersonal relations, and they were overwhelmingly nonviolent in their conflict resolution. In terms of species atypical behavioral repertoires, in other words, behavioral repertoires that were not characteristic of Homo sapiens, for the vast majority of our evolutionary development. It's really only in the last 5% of our species' genetic history that we see war making and state making emerge as repertoires of behavior. I'm quoting Dr. Peter Verbeek here on his ethological perspectives on war and peace, also in War, Peace, and Human Nature. We also know that the evidence shows war making emerged in tandem with agriculture approximately 10,000 years ago, and state making followed approximately 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. We also know that war making and state making are species atypical behavioral repertoires because for the first 95% of our history as a species, these were not common behaviors. We also know that state making and war making are forms of aggression, and we can define aggression as behaviors carried out to pursue active control of resources and the social environment at the expense of others. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the modern state, how the modern state arose, and then also the emergence of constitutional frameworks. If we think about the leading theories of the development of the early modern state, we see that many of them focus on the relationship between war making and state making. Hendrik Spruit highlights this relationship. He shows that war making and state making were interactive processes through the development and advance in military technology, the transition from feudal warfare to standing armies, development of economic efficiencies of scale in production, and then also the expansion of taxation. This theory of modern state making is really most succinctly summarized by Charles Tilly in his essay, War Making and State Making as Organized Crime, and his thesis has become known as the War Makes States theory. And Tilly shows us that the emergence of modern states resulted from the gradual institutionalization of 4 activities. And when I say modern states, I'm really talking about in the last 600 years, over the last 600 years. So the emergence of modern states resulted from 4 primary activities: war making, state making, protection, and extraction. War making would be state elites' elimination of rivals outside of their territory. State making would be the elimination of rivals within their territory. Protection would be institutions or activities that protect their patrons, even from others within the territory. And extraction is the development of taxation and getting the revenue to pay for the other 3 activities. And then with these activities, as these activities increase, institutions develop to carry them out. So for example, the army, the standing army, develops to carry out war making. Police and surveillance apparati develop for state making. In other words, for the elimination of rivals within the territory. Courts and representative assemblies develop as institutions to protect the constituents and patrons of the elite state level actors. And finally, tax and accounting agencies are developed to carry out the extraction of the resources from the people within the territory. Tilly also points out, in terms of early modern states in war, that many wars were carried out for personal reasons, perhaps by greed or avarice, by the state makers, by the monarchs, by the sovereigns. And then, of course, there were many wars of ambition to gain additional territory, and also wars of honor, or these are wars of revenge, where a state leader would carry out the war because they were insulted or to get revenge for previous losses. So these were some reasons why early state makers were going to war. And of course, these were problematic for the people who lived in their territories. And war making and the constitution of the army became mechanisms of coercive exploitation by state level rulers of their own people. This happened through conscription. Of course, people died in battle abroad or from foreign invasion. The use of the standing army was also a danger to the populace when it was used to put down revolts or rebellions or protests. And of course, the creation of the army as an institution and war making is extremely expensive. So it also necessitated higher taxes. Tilley argues that the emergence of constitutional frameworks in this period really began to develop because of popular resistance to coercive exploitation, which then the resistance forced the would-be power holders to concede protection and constraints on their action. So, for example, the protection might be the development of rights in constitutional frameworks. In terms of constraints, constitutions eventually spelled out how and when states could wage war, or under what conditions they could do that, or separated the finances, the authorization of the finances from the war-making authority itself. But Tilley really points to popular resistance as a key component in the development of constitutional frameworks as a constraint on the war-making ability and also state-making ability of the political level, political society level rulers of the state. He writes, popular resistance to war-making and state-making made a difference. When ordinary people resisted vigorously, authorities made concessions, guarantees of rights, representative institutions, courts of appeal, and those concessions in their turn constrained the later paths of war-making and state-making. I use a peace ethology lens, as does Dr. Peter Verbeek, and we've written a edited volume, Peace Ethology, Behavioral Processes and Systems of Peace, that describes this approach, this research approach. So if we think about peace ethology, it is a study of peaceful behaviors and the processes and systems by which those behaviors are exhibited and developed. And through the peace ethology lens, we can say that war-making and state-making emerged as species atypical behaviors, and that people resisted species atypical behaviors of state-making and war-making, partly because they were atypical and partly because they're not congruent with the predominant characteristics of Homo sapiens as we developed over hundreds of thousands of years. We could also say that the settlement through constitutional frameworks of these conflicts between society level and state level actors was designed to limit war-making and state-making. And finally, these constraints are both partial and tenuous as a recuperation of species-typical egalitarian social relations and in terms of their limits on species atypical aggression. They're partial in that life in states is organized and socially reproduced through species atypical aggression. And again, I would point out that here by aggression, we mean behaviors carried out to pursue active control of resources and the social environment at the expense of others. And these constitutional frameworks were also tenuous in that state level actors sometimes use the organizations of the state to carry out species atypical aggression beyond constitutional limits, including killing. Now I'd like to move the discussion to constitutions as peace systems and the function of peace constitutions. Now there is no state that has non-killing as an affirmative state policy, but of course there are policies and frameworks that limit and constrain killing by the state or by the institutions of the state. And in this talk, I'd really like to focus on how constitutions operate as peace systems, and then also the function of very particular constitutions that we could call peace constitutions. And I'll provide a definition of what I mean by that. If we think about peace systems, we're really thinking about institutions or arrangements that pattern their members' interactions toward peace. And constitutional frameworks are peace systems to the extent that they pattern social behavior in ways that promote and sustain peace. In terms of the direct peace functions of constitutions, uh, constitutions institutionalize constraints on state making and war making. This notion of direct peace is corollary to Johann Galtung's negative peace. By negative peace, Galtung does not mean negative as something bad or undesirable. He just means the negation of war or violence, direct violence. So by direct peace, I mean institutionalized constraints on state making and war making in the constitutional context. Another direct peace function of constitutions is rule of law politics. The political theorist Judith Shklar said that the ultimate political struggle is always between war and law. And by war, Shklar meant the aggression of war making and unconstrained state making carried out by the state against its own people. So one of the things constitutions do, especially constitutions characterized by the rule of law, is that they constrain state making and war making against the people of the state. I would also like to talk about some structural peace functions of constitutions. When I talk about structural peace, this is akin to Johann Galtung's notion of positive peace. In other words, these are the things that help us realize human flourishing. And these in constitutions appear as affirmative obligations of the state to the members of society. And these are provisions in constitutions like promoting the general welfare. It could be affirmative public welfare rights, publicly financed education, publicly financed health provisions, and other positive peace or structural peace functions of the Constitution to promote human flourishing. At the same time, we have to admit and realize and acknowledge that constitutional frameworks have also been used to institutionalize or have failed to prevent war, slavery, genocide, economic exploitation, and other crimes and atrocities. So my argument here is not that every constitution is effective in reducing killing, but that there are many ways that constitutions do have effective constraints on state level killing and violence. And also I would just reiterate that war, slavery, genocide, economic exploitation, these are all species atypical patterns of aggressive and violent behavior, which we do not see in the first 95% of the history of the species. So these also develop with agriculture, war making, state making, not caused by any one of those things in particular, but coinciding with their development. Now I'd like to introduce the idea of peace constitutions. And peace constitutions are specific constitutional frameworks that place direct peace limitations and structural peace obligations on the state. So I would say that any constitution that places direct peace limitations, for example, on war or other forms of violence and killing, and structural peace obligations counts as a peace constitution. Now, whether it's functional or not, that's another matter, and I'll discuss that in a minute. In terms of the direct peace limitations for a peace constitution, they would include things like the renunciation or strict limitation of the state's right or authority to make war, and the prohibition against maintaining a permanent military establishment. So if we look at constitutions from around the world and we see either or both of these, we would recognize them as examples of direct peace limitations on the state and as characteristics of what we could term peace constitutions. We'd also look for structural peace obligations in constitutions to identify them as peace constitutions. Of course, these would include guarantees of welfare or employment, guarantees of education, some provision of health, public health, or housing provisions in some constitutions. It could even include a constitutional right for a cultured life, which some constitutions include, and it may even include the right to peace, which is a internationally recognized human right. So this is how I define peace constitutions, that they would include both direct peace limitations and structural peace obligations. They might not include all of those listed here, but they would include one or more of each. If we think about what makes a peace constitution functional or not, I would argue that when state-level actors, when I say state-level actors, I'm talking about politicians and lawmakers and executives, chief executives. When state-level actors govern within the direct peace limits and act to fulfill the structural peace obligations, we can say that that is a functional peace constitution. A semi-functional peace constitution would be one in which the state-level actors only partially comply with the direct peace limitations and only partially fulfill the structural peace provisions encoded in the Constitution. And of course, a non-functional peace constitution would be one in which the state-level actors do not comply with the limitations and do not fulfill the obligations constitutionally established. And by obligations and limitations, I'm talking about those direct peace limits, peace limitations, and then those obligations to provide things that help us flourish as human beings. Jun Sasimoto, a Japanese lawyer and scholar, recognizes 7 countries that have peace constitutions. He recognizes Bolivia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Japan, Panama, the Philippines, and Venezuela. So you could look at their constitutions and you could see what some of those limitations and obligations are that would classify them as peace constitutions. Excuse me. Again, that does not mean that those states might not practice killing as state policy in other ways, perhaps by the death penalty. Some of them have abolished the death penalty, but it doesn't mean that they're an affirmative non-killing state. But it does mean that they have constitutional constraints and obligations that reduce killing and increase human flourishing. It's also worth noting, even though there are only a handful of states with recognized peace constitutions, there are many states that have taken constitutional steps towards non-killing, even if it's not an affirmative state policy. And that would also include countries without armies. Maida, in his Guntai no Nai Koka, or States Without Army, recognizes 27 states, and Christoph Barbie, in his Non-Militarization and Countries Without Armies chapter, in Non-Killing Security in the State, recognizes 26 countries without armies. So that's, as far as those being constitutionally limited, that would satisfy one of the criteria of a peace constitution. But in terms of the more comprehensive examination of peace constitutions, Maida just recognizes the 7 listed here. I'm sorry, Sasimoto recognizes the 7 listed here. Now I'd really like to focus on 2 case studies. I'd like to look at Costa Rica's peace constitution. First, I'll do that. And then I'll examine Japan's peace constitution. In both cases, I'll give a little bit of historical context and background about how the peace constitutions came about in both countries. I'll explain how they function as peace constitutions institutionally, at the level of the state level actors and politics. And I'll also talk about the effects they've had on the political culture of Costa Rica and Japan, both in terms of the peace constitution's constraints on the state's authority to kill, but then also on the effects they've had on the political culture and people's attitudes about killing. So this is where I'd like to really examine some empirical evidence of peace constitutions and see sort of what is the potential and what are the current limitations of peace constitutions as a non-killing state policy. So I'll begin with Costa Rica. Just a very short thumbnail sketch of the history of Costa Rica. In 1838, Costa Rica became an independent state with democratic governance. In 1869, it established free and mandatory elementary education. In 1877, it abolished the death penalty. It was not the first state to abolish the death penalty, but it's an early adopter of death penalty abolition, which is a non-killing policy par excellence. Of course, Costa Rica has had its share of internal conflict as well. In 1917, there was a coup d'etat followed by a 2-year dictatorship. But then after 2 years, democracy was restored and then was uninterrupted until a couple of decades later. From 1944 to 1948, Costa Rica had the largest army in its history. And it also had a series of 3 disputed elections. I should mention that one of the reasons it had the largest army in its history was that the United States had encouraged Costa Rica to increase its armaments because of Costa Rica's proximity to Panama and, of course, the Panama Canal. And this was in the lead up to and the context of World War II. In 1948, the third of 3 elections was disputed, and there was a civil war in Costa Rica. Jose Figueres was a private citizen. He was not a politician, but he created a private militia and defeated the Costa Rican army in the Civil War. And then he led a junta and established martial law. So this was the resolution of the Civil War came through the establishment of martial law under Figueres. However, in 1948, Figueres had a breakthrough idea for solving the problem of political violence in Costa Rica, both within the state and in Costa Rica's relationships with other states, not just its neighbors. So in 1948, Figueres dissolved the army and called for new elections. When this happened, after the announcement of the dissolution of the army, the deposed former president, who had fled to Nicaragua, led an invasion from Nicaragua, which is to the north of Costa Rica, into Costa Rica. And Figueres and the Costa Rican government invoked the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance. And then the Organization of American States was notified. But once this happened, once the treaty was invoked, the invasion collapsed. And Costa Rica and Nicaragua signed a pact of unity. So this was the first challenge to the country of Costa Rica just after it had dissolved its army. There was an invasion, there was an appeal to the international community or international relations in the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance. And this was enough to thwart the invasion without the reconstitution of an army. In 1949, there was a new constitution of Costa Rica. And if we think about it as a peace constitution, then we'll look exactly for direct peace limitations, which constrain war making and the maintenance of an army. And we see that in Article 12 of the 1949 Constitution, which is Article 12 is unamended today, the army as a permanent institution is proscribed. In other words, there is no state authority to maintain a permanent army or standing army. Additionally, as a direct peace limitation, Article 147 states that the cabinet may solicit from the Legislative Assembly the authorization to decree military recruitment and to organize the army and to negotiate peace. Since 1949, the Costa Rican cabinet has not solicited that authorization, and there has been no military recruitment or reconstitution of the army. So we could say it's an uninterrupted peace constitution. And now you might think, well, how does a state protect its security or defend itself if it has a peace constitution that forbids the standing army? In 1950 and 1951, there were popular revolts in Costa Rica, but the state dealt with these just with its regular police forces. Now, I should mention that the Costa Rican police and guard does not have any prohibition on killing. So again, we have to think about the state-making level of the activity of the state. Remember that state-making is the institutions of police and also includes surveillance apparatus. So I'm not arguing that Costa Rica, again, has an affirmative non-killing state policy, but certainly there are these constraints, and this shows some of the promise of peace constitutions. Those popular revolts were put down just with police power and not with the use of an army directed against the civil society of Costa Rica. In 1950, there was another invasion from Nicaragua, and the resistance by the Costa Ricans was spontaneous and voluntary. And then the Organization of American States sent civilian monitors. They did no members of the Organization of American States sent armed forces, but they did send civilian monitors. And again, as before in 1948, the invasion collapsed. So again, for the second time, Costa Rica was able to maintain its integrity as a state and as a political community without an army. I'm going to jump ahead a few decades here. By the early 1980s, by 1981, the then president of Costa Rica allowed the US Central Intelligence Agency and Contra rebels who were fighting in Nicaragua to the north to operate in Costa Rican territory. This was highly debated action by the state, and there was a lot of opposition by Costa Rican civil society. So this was not an entirely popular decision by the Costa Rican president. In 1983, the US invaded Panama, and Costa Rica, Panama borders Costa Rica to Costa Rica south, and the Costa Rican government came out opposed to the US invasion of Panama. So this is a period when Costa Rica is both cooperating with and opposing some US actions in Central America and vis-a-vis its neighbors. One of the ways, I would say another breakthrough state policy that Costa Rica used to get out of this, I wouldn't call it a trap, but get it out of this seesaw between opposing and cooperating with US policy, was the president made a declaration of perpetual, active, and unarmed neutrality. So in 1983, Costa Rica became a neutral nation recognized under international law. I'll just back up and say one more thing there. Because of the declaration of neutrality, the Costa Rican government also asked the CIA and the Contras to leave Costa Rican territory, which they did. So they were no longer hosting or supporting operations by the US or by the Contras in the Costa Rican territory. Another way that Costa Rica has solved its problems through a non-killing approach is in border disputes. From 1998 to 2009, there was a long-running border dispute with Nicaragua. Again, from 2010 to 2015, there was yet another border dispute between Costa Rica and Nicaragua. And both of these disputes were resolved through the International Court of Justice. So again, there was no reconstitution of a Costa Rican army, and there wasn't any campaign to use killing or state violence to solve either of the disputes with Costa Rica's neighbor to the north. We might also think, I mentioned the right to peace as a possible peace obligation in some peace constitutions. I'd like to talk a little bit about the right to peace in the Costa Rican constitutional context and how the notion of the right to peace and the recognition of the right to peace has been effective as a non-killing protection and state policy. In 2003, the US government under then President George W. Bush tried to form a coalition of governments around the world called the Coalition of the Willing. And these would be allies of the United States that would support the US attack and war against Iraq. At first, Costa Rica decided to add its name to the US Coalition of the Willing. And immediately when it was announced that Costa Rica would be a member of the US Coalition of the Willing, there were lawsuits brought against the Costa Rican government. One of them was brought forward by a law student who was still studying for his law degree. And in the lawsuit, they charged that the Costa Rican government's participation, even in name only, of the Coalition of the Willing, violated the Constitution and the 1983 Declaration of Neutrality. This went all the way to the Supreme Constitutional Court of Costa Rica, and in a unanimous ruling, the Constitutional Court issued that this participation in the Coalition of the Willing, even in name only, was a violation of the Costa Rican Constitution and a violation of the UN Charter and of a fundamental principle of the Costa Rican identity, which is peace as a fundamental value. So this is part of the development of the notion of a right to peace. In 2006, the president of Costa Rica issued an executive order regulating the importation and manufacture of weapons and permitting extraction of uranium and thorium, permitting nuclear fuel development and manufacturing nuclear reactors. Again, coming out of civil society, there were lawsuits that this executive order violated the Constitution. In this case, again, there was a unanimous ruling by the Constitutional Court against the president and against the executive order. And they found that the executive order was a violation of the right of Costa Ricans to a healthy environment, a threat to human health, a violation of international law and of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that it violated the value of peace and the UN Declaration on the Right of Peoples to Peace. So here again is the right to peace coming in as a constraint on state policy in the Costa Rican context. In 2008, there was another executive order by the president, this time to arm police with military-grade weapons. And again, there was a lawsuit against the executive order, charging that it violated the Constitution. And again, there was a unanimous ruling by the Constitutional Court of Costa Rica that found that such weapons, in other words, military-grade weapons, are prohibited except in the case of invasion, a state of siege, or during a state of emergency. So the executive order was overturned and the Costa Rican state was not able to arm police with military-grade weapons. I've talked about some of the constitutional framework, some of the history and how this institutionalization of a peace constitution has worked, and also some challenges to the state's authority and the success of members of civil society to overturn state policies, to protect their right to peace and to ensure limited killing or non-killing. I also like to talk about the emergent culture of peace in Costa Rica. So if we think about the culture of peace, we're talking about other aspects of Costa Rican society and culture that reinforce peace as a fundamental value of Costa Rica. One way we could find out about the ranking or comparison of Costa Rica versus other states is through the Global Peace Index, which is carried out by the Institute for Economics and Peace annually. We can see that, in fact, Costa Rica ranks about 38th out of 163 countries in the Global Peace Index. And Costa Rica is lagging on the Peace Index because of its homicide rate, access to weapons, the number of people in jail, and also the perceived criminality in society, which is an attitudinal measure. On the other hand, Costa Rica is leading in the rankings in terms of the low number of deaths from conflicts, both inside and outside of the territory, the low number of external conflicts fought, 0, weapons exports and imports, the number of armed services personnel, nuclear and heavy weapons, political terror, political stability. In this case, it's very stable, and in the number of displaced people. So this gives us a little bit broader view of the context of peace in Costa Rica. In the Happy Planet Index in 2016, Costa Rica ranked #1 out of 140 countries. It actually ranked 75th on ecological footprint, but by 2015, 99% of electricity in Costa Rica was already being generated from renewable sources, and Costa Rica has a very ambitious target for carbon neutrality. In some of the areas where they were leading on the Happy Planet Index, they were #10 in well-being, they were #30 in measures of life expectancy, and in terms of inequality, they were #39 out of 140 countries. In terms of further institutionalization beyond the Constitution of a culture of peace, in 1980, the University of Peace was established by the United Nations General Assembly, and the main campus of the University of Peace is in Costa Rica. In 1997, there was a law passed requiring peace education in every school. In 1997, there were changes to the legal system to utilize mediation and peaceful conflict resolution in the legal system. In 2004, there was a National Directorate of Alternative Conflict Resolution. In 2006, there was a National Commission established for the prevention of violence and promotion of social peace. And in 2009, Costa Rica established a Ministry of Justice and Peace. Costa Rica has also been termed a global Good Samaritan by BRISC. Some of the evidence for its role as a global Good Samaritan include the 1987 Esquipulas Peace Agreement. This was an agreement spearheaded by then Costa Rican President Dr. Oscar Arias, and it was a settlement of the civil wars in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, for which President Arias of Costa Rica received the Nobel Peace Prize. And I'd also mention that Dr. Oscar Arias is an honorary sponsor of the Center for Global Non-Killing, and he was president of Costa Rica from 1986 to 1990, and again from 2006 to 2010. In 1994, Costa Rica also persuaded Panama to disband and constitutionally prescribe its standing army. So there was a change to the Panamanian Constitution in 1994, and in Article 310 of the Panamanian Constitution, it states the Republic of Panama shall not have an army. So Panama is one of the 26 or 27 countries in the world that doesn't have an army, and that's still current as of this talk in 2021. I'll also mention that Costa Rica has been a signatory to all of the international treaties and protocols on death penalty abolition, another essential non-killing policy. Now I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about Japan's peace constitution and the promise and limits of peace constitution there. I'm not going to give a long history of Japan, but I suffice it to say that after the Meiji Restoration of 1868, Japan fought a Sino-Japanese war, a war against China. There was the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. Japan was also a belligerent in World War I on the side of the Allies. And then, of course, leading up to what we call World War II, there was Japanese colonialism in Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, and into China in the years and decade before what we would say was the start of World War II. Without going into all of the details of the killing and the violent capacity of the Japanese state in the imperial and colonial era, I will say that in World War II, Japan's belligerent actions before and during the war resulted in approximately 6 million civilian deaths. Of course, in 1945, the Japanese imperial government made an unconditional surrender to the Allies, and that began a period of US-led occupation. And at the beginning of the US-led occupation in 1945, two of the major objectives of the occupation were the demilitarization of Japan and the democratization of Japan. And it was in 1947 that the Constitution of Japan, which it currently has now and which goes and has gone unamended, came into force. And it's this 1947 Constitution, which is known even in Japan as Heiwa Kempo, or the Peace Constitution, was established. The 1947 Peace Constitution has a very significant direct peace limitation, and that is Article 9 of the Constitution, in which there is a renunciation of war as a sovereign right of the nation and of the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. And Article 9 also prohibits land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential for that purpose. So Article 9 is the linchpin of the Japanese Peace Constitution in terms of the direct peace limitations. I should also say that one of the first rights mentioned in the 1947 Peace Constitution of Japan is the right to peace, which is mentioned in the preamble of the Constitution. In terms of structural peace obligations in the Japanese Constitution, there are several, but just to name two. Article 25 of the Constitution, Article 25 establishes the guarantee of minimum standards of wholesome and cultured living, of social welfare and security, and of public health. And Article 26 states the right of the people of Japan to receive an education. So we could think of these as structural peace obligations. I would say that compared to Costa Rica's peace constitution, which is a functional peace constitution, Japan's peace constitution is semi-functional. And I'll talk a little bit, I'm going to give a little bit of some historical context coming out of the establishment of the Constitution of why I argue that it is a peace constitution, but a semi-functional one. In the occupation period, which began in 1945, once the Chinese Revolution finished and the Communist Party of China became the ruling party in China, and of course, during and after the Korean War, beginning in 1950, the US occupation under MacArthur took some moves and encouraged some moves within Japan that in some ways began to compromise the peace constitution. First, there was a depurge of 20,000 former soldiers, including accused war criminals who had been jailed or charged with war crimes. And they had been purged from Japanese political society. They weren't able to hold office. Many of them were going to come up for trial, but 20,000 of them were depurged. And that was a decision of the occupation forces. During the beginning of the Korean War, there was also the establishment of a 75,000 man, 75,000 person National Police Reserve, led in part by former imperial military officers. And then that National Police Reserve became the National Security Force in 1952, and then was then renamed and reconstituted as the Japan Self-Defense Forces in 1954. The justifications for the development and establishment of the self-defense forces were primarily three reasons and three justifications. One was that they would be a force pledged to maintain only the minimum number of troops necessary to defend the territory of Japan. Another justification was that the SDF would be utilized not only for, but certainly for natural disaster relief, as Japan is natural disaster prone due to volcanoes, earthquakes, and typhoons. And they also justified the establishment of the self-defense forces by saying that it would be maintained as an apolitical civilian organization. In other words, not an army. There was a lot of civil society opposition, not only to the establishment of the self-defense forces, but more particularly to the relationship between Japan and the United States, and especially the security treaty between the Japan and the United States and the US bases across the Japanese archipelago. There was strong public opinion, more than 50% in favor of a declaration of neutrality in the 1950s. There were many Japanese citizens who said that Japan should declare neutrality and become, quote unquote, the Switzerland of the East. As I mentioned, there was also opposition to the alliance with the US at the time, and into the 1960s and up to 1959 and 1960, when the security treaty came up for renewal, there were sustained massive protests and demonstrations across the country. And it's estimated by Sasaki Uemura that up to 16 million Japanese citizens joined those protests in opposition to the renewal of the security treaty between Japan and the United States. There were some concessions to political society by state level actors. In the late 1960s, there was the declaration of the three non-nuclear principles against possessing nuclear weapons, against manufacturing nuclear weapons, and against allowing the introduction of nuclear weapons into Japanese territory. We learned 2009 or 2010 that in fact there were secret agreements between Japan and the United States in which the Japanese government knew about and permitted the introduction of nuclear weapons into Japanese territory by the United States. There was also a cap on defense spending at 1% of gross national product. That cap on defense spending came into policy in the late 1970s, and it's still going now, although Japan often tests that limit. When I say tests it, they're sometimes at 1.1% or so. They affirmed or reaffirmed a defense-only policy in the years coming out of that political turmoil and opposition to state policy. The Japanese government banned acquisition of offensive weapons, and then it also restricted weapons exports. And I would see all of these as concessions to the opposition to the state's policies coming out of the 1950s and 1960s. Then we should really look at the last 20 years, especially in the early 2000s, when Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro was the chief executive of the cabinet of Japan. That was at the time of 9/11 in the United States, the attack on 9/11 in the United States. And Koizumi said on the floor of the Diet, or the National Legislature, that the self-defense forces had military capabilities. So he said that they had military capabilities, which was the opposite of official constitutional interpretation. In 2001, Koizumi dispatched the Marine self-defenses to the Arabian Sea in support of the war against Afghanistan. In 2003, Koizumi relaxed Japan's arms export restrictions. And in 2004, Koizumi sent the SDF to Iraq, although not to combat areas. But these were quite big changes in sort of the status quo of policy going back decades. Also in 2004, the Liberal Democratic Party, which Koizumi was a elected legislator of, recommended a constitutional recognition of the self-defense forces as a national army, recommended the right of collective self-defense for Japan as a state policy, and also argued that citizens should have a duty to defend the country. Now, these were constitutional and policy recommendations by the LDP. Japan did declare the right of collective self-defense about 8 years later, 10 years later. And so far, however, the Constitution has not been amended to create a duty of citizens to defend the country or to reconstitute a national army or self-defense army, a jieigun. In reaction to some of what was happening when Prime Minister Koizumi was in power, 9 public citizens, prominent citizens in 2004 announced the establishment of the Article 9 Association. Article 9, of course, refers to the direct peace part of the Constitution, Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. And this became a local, chapter-based, grassroots network of citizens who were opposed to constitutional revision. This was a nonpartisan group. There were members and supporters, including elected representatives from, I think, all of the Japanese parties, even including the Liberal Democratic Party. There were members, even among local politicians, who were supporters of the Article 9 Association or who were active in the Article 9 Association. And the Article 9 Association carried out education activities, social and cultural events, publicity, political lobbying, and demonstrations, all to preserve Article 9 of the Constitution and to oppose constitutional revision. This graph shows attitudes toward constitutional revision versus the growth of A9A or Article 9 Association chapters. The line graph at the top with the blue triangles shows the support for revision, and this is in public opinion polling, asking citizens in public opinion surveys whether or not they supported or opposed revision of the Constitution. You can see that in 2004, 65% of survey respondents said that they supported revision of the Constitution. Now, the question was revision of the Constitution, not specifically revision of Article 9, but 65% said that they would support revision of the Constitution. 2004 is the same year that the Article 9 Association was established, and the green part or the shaded part of this graph shows the number of local chapters of the Article 9 Association in thousands. So from its establishment in 2004, in just 4 short years to 2008, there were more than 7,000 local chapters of the Article 9 Association in Japan. That's more than the number of towns, villages, and cities in the country of Japan. And you can see that as the number of A9A chapters increased, attitudes towards constitutional revision turned more and more towards opposing revision. On the specific question of Article 9, changing the peace plank of the Constitution, we see here that even in 2004, 47% or a plurality of citizens opposed revising Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. And then we can see that top line with the red triangles, which shows opposition to revising Article 9, increasing up to 60% of the Japanese public as the number of Article 9 associations increased to over 7,000 across the country. So this shows, I would argue, the effect of citizen organizing and resistance to the state or state level actors' intentions around the self-defense forces and war making and defense, moving the needle on their attitudes around the Constitution. I also want to talk about one other really, really important bit of data from the Japanese case. I would argue that a lack of citizens' willingness to fight in war is a possible proxy for an attitudinal orientation toward non-killing. And if we look at a survey this is from the World Values Survey, which is a survey that's been carried out in many countries around the world since 1980 or so. These are the results of respondents to that survey in South Korea, represented by black circles, the United States represented by blue circles, and Germany represented by green circles. And each circle represents a wave of the survey in that country. The survey respondents were asked, the question was framed something like, we all hope that there will not be another war, but if there is, would you be willing to fight for your country? Now in this graph, I'm just breaking out the responses from citizens who took the survey who were aged 15 to 29 years old. I chose the United States and Germany because the United States and Germany were also major fighters in World War II. And then of course, South Korea, I want to include South Korea because it's a neighbor of Japan. But this just gives us a little bit of comparison, the US versus Japan, Germany versus Japan, South Korea versus Japan. I don't have the Japanese data on this slide, but I'll show it on the next slide. You'll see here that the willingness to fight in terms of the survey results in South Korea was at a high in 1990. 86.9% of young people ages 18 to 29 years old in 1990 said that they would be willing to fight. That dropped to a low of 57.1 in 2011, and then it was back up to 70.6 as recently as 2018. As for the United States, also in 1990, that was a high for the number of young respondents who were willing to fight for their country at 82.5%. This is, of course, the last year of the Cold War, really, as well. And then you can see after 2001, in the beginning of the US war on terror, or the wars against Iraq and Afghanistan and wars in other countries, that the willingness to fight in the US drops in the 2006, 2011, and 2017 surveys to 40.9%, 41.3%, and 39.6%. In terms of the German data, the first data point is only, actually the first two data points in 1981 and 1990 are only for West Germany. And then the other data points are for the reunified Germany. You can see that the high in terms of the willingness to fight is 60% in 1999. And the low was back in 1990 for West Germany at 39.7% and stood at 41.8% in 2019. Now, again, I want to mention the lack of willingness to fight in war as a possible proxy for an attitudinal orientation toward non-killing. So these are the data for South Korea, the United States, and Germany. If we add the data for Japan, which is the only of these three countries with a peace constitution, we see a very markedly low willingness to fight for the country in Japan. And I think this is an attitudinal expression of non-killing orientation. I think I haven't looked at every country in the World Values Survey, but I've looked at dozens of them, and I'm pretty sure Japan has the lowest willingness to fight of all respondents in the surveys. And you can see here that the high was in 1981, when 17.8% of young respondents said that they would be willing to fight for their country. The low was 8% in 1990, when it was a historic high for the US and South Korea in the period of surveys. And in 2019, it stood at 8.8%. So you can see here, there's a very, very low willingness in Japan. If you look at the data for all age groups beyond 29 years old, Japan is also the lowest for those as well. But it's typically young people who are conscripted or who volunteer to fight for their country. So I think this is quite notable. If we compare, unfortunately, there's no World Values Survey data for Costa Rica, but if we compare Costa Rica and Japan, for example, on the Global Peace Index, in 2020, Japan was ranked number 12 out of 163 countries, excuse me. It's lagging on neighboring country relations, and a lot of that has to do with the unresolved history and legacy of the imperial era and World War II. But Japan is a leader in terms of the low number of internal and external conflicts fought, deaths from conflicts within and outside of the territory, low access to weapons, low violent crime, low political terror, high political stability, low displaced people, contributions to the UN Peacekeeping Fund, and a relatively low number of armed services personnel, that is the self-defense forces. The other comparison would be on the Happy Planet Index, which I talked about for Costa Rica. Here, Japan ranks number 58 out of 140 countries. It's lagging on its ecological footprint at 109th, but it's leading among nations on life expectancy at number 2 in the world. In inequality, it ranks 18th, and on well-being, it ranks 39th. When I say inequality is a ranking of 18, that means it has the 18th lowest level of inequality of the countries in the index. To conclude, thinking about the promises and limits of de facto non-killing state policies, and I say de facto non-killing state policies because no peace constitution in the world and no constitution in the world has de jure non-killing state policies. But in terms of the promises and limits, I think it's notable that since 1949, with the establishment of the Costa Rican Peace Constitution, since 1947, with the establishment of the Japanese Peace Constitution, no Costa Rican or Japanese citizen has killed in war since the adoption of those peace constitutions. And I think, especially with the Japanese case, but we also see in civil society organizing around the right to peace in Costa Rica, that there's evidence of proxy attitudes toward non-killing, both in the willingness to fight and in citizens' desire to constrain the violent potential and the killing potential of their states. Again, and as a final concluding remark, I do want to again reiterate that neither of these states and no other state in the world prescribes killing as a matter of domestic state policy, but that we can learn something from, for example, constitutions and especially peace constitutions in how we might further increase non-killing and formalize non-killing as state policy. I'll also mention that in 2014, Japanese defenders of the Peace Constitution were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And in 2015, the peoples of Japan and Costa Rica were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Neither time did they win, but this also shows international recognition of the role that Japanese and Costa Rican citizens have taken to defend their constitutional frameworks and their direct peace limitations and peace obligations within the political community. Thank you very much for joining me for this talk. I want to again thank the Center for Global Non-Killing and Dr. Jaume Evans-Pim. And I hope you will check out the center. There are a lot of articles and books available there on non-killing, including Nonkilling Security and the State, which may be of interest if you found this talk interesting. So thank you again for sharing this time, and take good care.